皆さんこんにちは。DJ の栗原です。本日はデグリード社の、パートナーセールスの VP のアンドリューさんと、ラーニングストラテジストの、アニーさんをお招きして、お話を進めていきたいと思います。それとですね、一緒にパネラーとしてですね、ラーニングフューチャーラーニング協会の浦山代表理事に来ていただいて、その3人を中心にですね、セッション、皆さんにですね、メッセージをお送りしたいと思います。まずはじめにですね、LXP についてアンドリューさんから、そしてフューチャーオブラーニングについて、アニーさんから、お話をいただきたいと思います。それでは、まずアンドリューさんからお話聞きたいと思います。LXP について、お話をお願いします。
Would you like to start as a LXP explanation first?
Certainly, yeah, absolutely. I think to understand what an LXP is for, you have to go back a little bit to the sort of perhaps the year 2000, the burst of the new e-learning industry, the huge explosion of online and digital content that came about. So I've worked in this industry for over 20 years. I've seen that growth. And I think one of the things to realise is that because it was such a huge explosion of content, it became very confusing for an individual. The learning management system, as we all know, couldn't cope with delivering all of these content assets. So Degreed, one of the first things that Degreed, and actually David Blake, our founder, along with others, came and decided on a system that could bring all of that content together, make sense of that content, and make it discoverable for the individual. So that's how the learner experience platform was created. Degreed started that section of the industry. Actually, it wasn't even called an LXP at the beginning. It was called an aggregation system, and then later on, a few years later, it was then coined as a learner experience platform. The difference is the learning management system fundamentally manages people and content. The learner experience platform is designed to help individuals discover content and to be able to access content from all over the web, digital, perhaps assets within the organization. And the LXP brings all of that into one location, as I mentioned before. The learner experience platform is a consumer tool by its design. It allows people to interact with corporate training in the same way that they would interact with the consumer tools that they use, such as Spotify or things along those lines, in playlists, being able to bring reason behind the learning, answering the question, why? Why do I want to learn something? Whereas the learning management system is traditionally used for, let's say, compliance content. You have to do this training. You have to do it by this date. The learning management system is, the LXP is much broader than that. It helps individuals with their personal goals of growth and building skill. So one of the other things that the learner experience platform is very good at doing is helping people build skill. And when you're thinking about skills in an organization, it's super important for organizations to understand the skills they have as a company. But equally, as me as an individual, I also need to understand my skills and how to build my skills. And the learner experience platform has artificial intelligence and machine learning built into it that will help drive that skill development for the individual and then the organization. So there's a significant difference. The fundamental difference: a learning management system manages content and manages the assignments of content, the training in the traditional sense, whereas the learner experience platform is much broader than that. It gives that individual choice and exposure to everything that's available to them as an individual. Does that help?
Yeah. Does that mean that we should change the push type of training to pull type of learning culture, right?
Yeah, learning culture is a really interesting one because ultimately we want people to be curious. We want individuals to search for new inspiration, new knowledge. And you're absolutely right. The learning management system pushes a piece of content to an individual, whereas the LXP produces curiosity. It allows someone to be curious and pull what they need when they need it. So yeah, absolutely.
So the portion of the learning which we are doing daily is much more bigger than the ratio than the push type training.
Yeah. So this slide here that you'll probably see on the later on. So this slide really indicates how individuals learn. So on the right-hand side, you will see things that are normally managed by a learning management system. They're infrequent. They're perhaps every year or every quarter. You'll be looking at doing particular pushed content.
Yes.
Whereas actually we learn all day, every day. We perhaps search on Google or we look at a newspaper article online. So that is also learning as well. So the learning experience platform will help organizations understand how people are learning, not just what they're learning, but also how they're learning. What mediums are they using? Is it video? Is it courses? Is it articles? Is it books? So again, what Degreed does and what an LXP should do is help organizations have a view of their employees and how they're learning.
Impressive.
続いてはアニーさんより、フューチャーオブラーニングについてちょっとお話をお伺いしたいと思います。お願いいたしま
Would you
す。
like to talk about the future learning? And also, please introduce yourself, your bio a little bit.
Okay, yes, of course. Thank you very much. Konnichiwa. My name is Annie Bayeux, and I am the Chief Learning Strategist at Degreed. A little bit about my background is I've spent about the last 25 years in Global 2000 organizations, notably around Europe and in the Americas. I started out as a head of digital learning in two separate corporate universities at Alstom that sells bullet trains and energy, so it is in the industrial sector, but also at BOSCH Automotive, and both concentrated on building digital learning organizations or encouraging digital learning throughout the organization. And this was back in the early 2000s when e-learning was barely getting started. Then I moved to different types of technical roles, notably in HRIS or HR technology, as we call that today. When I was at General Electric, I was in charge of HR processes and tools, which meant that we were the change management or digital transformation arm of GE, making sure that HR digital transformation was happening throughout the organization. So learning a lot about how we transform digitally our employees and more specifically the HR population. And finally, in the Global 2000 sector or the large corporation sector, I was the Chief Learning Officer of Danone. Danone, just to tell you a little bit about their DNA, it was 100,000 people globally in over 77 countries. And under my responsibility, I had about 200 learning and development employees across the globe. Most of these employees were concentrated on deploying training. And then, yeah, absolutely. So we had a very healthy ratio to support the 100,000 employees development on every topic from leadership and management to technical training. And all of that was within the scope of Danone Academy.
Wow. So many people.
Yeah, we have 500 in Degreed today. So now you want me to talk about the future of learning.
Okay.
So
shall we move on to the topic of the future learning?
Right.
How we can change our learning for the future?
Yeah, and I would love to, thank you for the question. I would love to talk a little bit about the need of change before going into what the future of learning is actually going to look like. So why do we need to change? The reason why we need to change is because the world is already changing around us. What we've seen, and actually what the pandemic has shown us, is that change in the world is accelerating beyond our control. We've heard of the term VUCA.
Yeah.
We are all living in a VUCA world, which is volatile, uncertain, agile. And we know that the only way to stay competitive in this world is to have an agile organization. We see a lot of influence, digital influence from consumer apps that is influencing the expectations of the learner. We also see that, and the pandemic actually showed us this, is that CEOs want to move from being operationally effective. You know, we talked 10 years ago or even 5 years ago about operational excellence. That is typically and traditionally the way that we create competitiveness. Can we operate more efficiently than our competitors? And so for that time, traditionally, CEOs wanted to create a very robust and scalable organization. And that meant that we had to have very defined roles, very defined expertise that stayed and worked together for many, many years to create a tight, operationally organized teams. Today, that causes a rigid organization. And when we have something that's unexpected, like the pandemic, we're unable to change.
Yeah, that's right.
And CEOs now realize the key words are more around strategic alignment to business, around resiliency, and around agility to move people quickly into new roles, not in a matter of months, but in a matter of weeks or in a matter of days.
Adaptability.
Absolutely. And so when we understand this ecosystem that we're working in, we understand that transformation is an everyday reality. And if transformation is an everyday reality, our ability to upskill or reskill or deep skill is going to be our biggest challenge, but also our biggest opportunity to stay competitive. So that is the urgency of change, the urgency of transformation today. But at the same time, when we look at the CIO, the head of IT, who's trying to bring together not only work productivity tools, but trying to do this in a way that increases employee engagement, to make a more modern digital workplace. In fact, to make the same workplace, to make it as modern as the tools we use in our own personal lives. This pressure coming from the CIO is really around creating how can we as HR help and partner with the CIO to create a better employee experience.
But most of the companies, HR divisions, they are, slave divisions, like from the top management, just take the order, just
Right.
And how do you improve that relationship? How do you?
Yeah, absolutely. So there has been a disconnect between HR and L&D and the business. And HR over the last few years has been really trying to concentrate on how to better partner with the business. Moving from KPIs and data that is very interesting for HR and shifting towards a more focused, how do we impact the business and really partner with the business in meaningful ways that help when we do transformation to actually help keep a workforce not only aligned with the skills they need to better perform their jobs, but also to make a bigger impact on what counts for the business, the
Yeah,
priorities in the business.
I think it's very important because of the HRD division of the Japanese company tend to measure the number of the people course they have taken
Yeah.
or just a passing rate of the test or something. But I would like to ask Andrew about what is the impact of the learning? Which point you are going to focus on when we embrace the learning of cooperation? Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Certainly. So thank you for that question. I think one thing to realize is it's not just about training hours.
Yeah.
It's not just about the number of completions. I think the important thing to remember is that any training in an organization, any learning that the individual does has to have impact. If it isn't aligned to business impact, then it's very difficult for business leaders to understand the value of training. So the number of hours, it doesn't matter really almost. So one of the things to remember is to really think about when you're delivering a learning ecosystem, an LXP, an LMS, it doesn't matter what it is, you need to think about what does the business really need and how is that aligned to business success. So those business owners, the people that are managing lines of business, speak to them, talk to them, ask them what's important to them, to their organization, and help align what you're doing as an HR, learning and development, training department. Align what you're doing to impact their business. Then, at the end of the day, the value of what you're doing, the value of the learning the individual is participating in, will have a better defined impact on the organization, which leads to a greater value for the work that L&D does.
I think so. Yeah. So in that sense, I would like to talk about, hear about your experience at Danone. Just like he said, you did the key role of the transformation role at the Danone. So would you like to explain about your a little bit about your Danone?
Absolutely. So when I joined Danone, I realized very quickly that we were looking at the wrong metrics in terms of learning. So we had an LMS. We were paying a lot of money for that LMS. And we realized it was hovering around 4% usage on this system. And most of that usage was around compliance training. Are we making sure that from a regulatory perspective, the things that keep us open, the things that allow us to operate in many markets, which is very important in terms of training. We were focusing all of our energy, all of our time, all of our budget on this compliance and mandatory training. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but that wasn't driving a good, positive learning culture. Employees had a negative or neutral view on learning. They didn't see learning as a part of being able to help their career. And above all, they weren't curious to stretch their skills. They weren't curious to think about how they can grow. In other words, they didn't have a solid growth mindset. Now, to change that, we had to think about a way, instead of impacting the LMS, was a great work tool for the 200 L&D across the globe. And it created efficiency. It created a better way of working for L&D. But the problem is, that was too focused on HR. We mentioned earlier about this HR partnership with the business. The only way to change the relationship or that partnership is to really focus on the people who are actually doing the business work. Business employees, people in the BUs, people who were client-facing. So the 100,000 employees that didn't have a system or a way of accessing easily content. And so what we did is we started to look around and figure out that an LXP actually was the solution. An LXP that concentrated on improving employee experience, that concentrated on driving a more positive and curious learning culture within the organization. And the only way to do that was shifting between being an order taker, I'll come in and I'll create the content that my senior stakeholder asked me to create, to something that was more self-driven, something that was more employee-owned, putting the development in the hands of the employees so they can decide not only what they were going to learn, they could find what they needed to learn to do their job,
by themselves.
and they could discover what they could learn and for their future role. So they could start thinking about their mobility instead of just concentrating development on actual immediate performance.
So you begin the autonomy learning by employees, right?
Absolutely. Positive learning culture only can come through something that's employee-owned or self-driven. So Degreed does research every year. This is our 4th year in doing it. Sometimes we partner with Harvard Publishing to do this research. This research is called How the Workforce Learns. So we've learned a lot about what makes a negative learning culture and what are the difference between, what are the elements that are present when we have a positive learning culture. And what we found out is the more that we do learning in the flow of work, in other words, we take care of not only that mandatory and compliance-driven, we've got to do that well, but moreover, we have to create this environment where people can create a daily learning ritual. That means acquiring knowledge through articles, podcasts, videos, learning by doing, learning by watching others, and learning by being in teams where they can collaborate and learn off of each other. And that means that not only managers, but subject matter experts need to help create and share content. And that really drives in what we call positive learning.
So you woven the learning into the work?
Absolutely. So one of the big principles of the future of learning is this idea of learning in the flow of work or woven into work, the way we like to call it. Learning in the flow of work was coined by Josh Bersin, but it had originally a very restrictive view, meaning how can we embed learning into some of our productivity tools. But that was all digital types of transformation. The way we look at it at Degreed is that that is great for knowledge acquisition, but that's not enough for skill building. How do we build those skills? It's woven into the work. That means when we're doing it on the job, that means shadowing, that means mentoring and coaching, that means the ability to do a stretch assignment or secondment when we're looking at activities beyond the scope of our current job. That's where we see woven into work being the most impactful.
Yeah, thank you very much. But you see so many great success in, for example, in Danone, at Danone. But I think that it is not an easy job. Probably you had many efforts to change people, change the culture of entire company. How did you do that?
Yeah, it's really funny because I remember distinctly my first meeting with a senior stakeholder, a GM of our waters division, and he came in to ask me, how can Danone Academy help improve his business? At the time, we were looking at a global, what we call the One Danone transformation. And so looking about how we can not only reorganize our people, that how do we make sure that they're upskilled and knowing what their new roles are, not only knowing what their new roles are, but also making sure they have the skills to complete their jobs. And I mentioned to him, talking about, okay, what have you done in the past? I said, look at here, I had prepared some KPIs. And these KPIs, I said, we've trained your people in this many hours. They've completed this many courses. And he looked at me and said, how does that help my business? I don't understand these KPIs and how that links to actual business performance. And that is where I understood that we're actually measuring the wrong thing. Those KPIs are fantastic to prove that my teams were busy, that HR were busy, but it didn't have any relationship to how we could help them perform their jobs more efficiently, with more expertise, and more quickly.
More creative work.
Right. I understood that measuring skill levels would give business leaders the opportunity to do strategic workforce planning, to be able to understand the capability of their workforce, and to, more importantly, to move around that workforce with more agility so they are able to be more responsive to a disrupted market.
Good agility.
Yeah.
To be more agile. I suppose.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the whole idea of skills in the first place, the whole idea of not measuring the typical, what I like to call vanity metrics, because it really shows us, like I said, what we do as an organization, as an L&D organization, as an HR organization. It's great for our CHRO, but the CEO cares more about workforce planning.
Yeah.
They care more about capability planning, because they need to have the freedom to shape the organization according to market needs, according to their strategic priorities. And there is a misalignment. And more, what the role of HR is to understand and be completely aligned to the business, moving their activities and their KPIs to focus on this business impact.
So actually the division's people are lacking in that sense, right? Understanding the business impact of top management.
Yeah, and I think, and that's a really interesting point. The skills of an HR department or a learning and development department are different today. They need to be asking different questions. They need to increase their knowledge about the operations of the business to be able to reflect and determine what's best to help drive those priorities. So one of the things that I'm seeing in the industry today, with all my sort of work that I do with our strategic partnerships, is the drive of changing roles and changing skills of the learning and development and training departments. Their skills for the future are different than they are today. So it's really important when we're talking about a modern learning ecosystem is to understand the skills you need as a business, as a group, to support the rest of the organization. They are different. We all need to adapt and be agile, and we all need to learn new things to grow in today's industry, in today's fast-paced industries.
So first of all, HRD divisions people have to change by themselves, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges. You know, as a head of learning, you understand that learning in L&D essentially has to transform itself. Do the teams have the right skills to be more digitally focused, to understand the data around employee engagement, and to understand how to keep that engagement high so we can not only attract the best talent, but develop them in ways that are going to keep that talent within the organization, what we call retention in HR. And retention, more and more, especially with younger generations, is a big issue. In the past, what we saw is retention in our parents' generation was not an issue. Typical tenures were probably more around 20 and 30 years. We stayed with the same company. Today, it was already starting with the millennial generation, where they became, they were the ones that started the gig economy, right? Saying, I'm going to go around and work smaller jobs that interest me, where I can show off my skills, but also will stretch my skills so I can develop into something new. This perpetual transformation. They're the generation that embraced it. The generation that is now coming up, Gen Z, they have this expectation inborn. They are looking at maybe 10 years of anywhere between 1 and 3 years, and they find that normal. Because remember, they don't remember a time where Google didn't exist. What Google did was shorten our attention spans and made everything a little bit more bite-sized. Not only content was more bite-sized, but now jobs and our focus is more bite-sized. And we're bringing that into the corporate environment where they want that same kind of shorter focused areas. And they become a lot more impatient when it comes to doing the same thing year over year or staying within the same company that doesn't give them an opportunity to have that diversity that they're looking for.
They more focus on the purpose of work they do. So.
Absolutely. Purposeful. Purpose. And the idea of purpose also comes from this consumer market. We see that we want to buy products with companies with the values that we have, with a purpose or a mission that is beyond just selling a product. How do companies help build communities? And, we talk about a wider stakeholder group than just the investors on the stock market. They are one stakeholder, but another stakeholder is the community that we operate in, the nations that we operate in. And that wider stakeholder group has to have a purpose. So when employees come into the workforce, they don't want to just have a job. They want that job to be linked to a value or a purpose that they believe in. And they will leave companies that don't share those values, that don't share that same mission or purpose, which is very different from the generations before.
People are searching for a meaning of their life and also the job. So that in the United States, a great resignation is occurred right now. Because of the pandemic, they start thinking about their purpose of life and also the job life.
And the Great Resignation was actually re-coined by Josh Bersin in the HR industry, saying it's actually not just the Great Resignation. People aren't just resigning and not doing anything else. He calls it the Great Migration. And that's where they're migrating. They're migrating to companies that are more in phase with the way they want to work, their values, and their mindset. And a lot of times they're looking for companies that will help inspire a growth mindset. Can this company help me to develop and be a better person tomorrow than I was today?
It's very important. People started to notice about that. Okay, I would like to ask one question. It's very important. How we can create a positive learning culture you mentioned on your lecture, and also I would like to ask the key role of manager or leader how they can assist to create a learning culture.
I think that positive learning culture, and like I said, Degreed, we've done a lot of research on what are the elements that we need to have create a positive learning culture. But I think the easiest way to describe it is in a model that McKinsey created called You, Me, We. And You, Me, We, in terms of the future of learning, means that we concentrate in 3 different pillars. The you part about it is when it's very typical when training departments or learning and development says you need to do this, you need to do that. That's a compliance or mandatory or regulatory training that we're looking for, right? And we know what that looks like. We've done it for the last 20, 30, 40 years. That's all been very top down. You need to do this, you need to do that. But more and more, what creates a positive learning culture is the me and the we. So the me is what's in it for me. When L&D focuses on the personalization, the individualization of learning, to respond better to that question, what's in it for me, we focus on individual learning, personalized learning. And the we factor is the last element to this pillar. And that we means how do we collectively learn together? Traditionally, this is called social learning, right? Social learning is learning from each other, watching, observing, mentoring, shadowing. All of this is very important for that, to create this ecosystem. So when L&D concentrates too much just on the we, what we have is a culture that stagnates. When we think about also how can we respond to those personalization, how can we work better as teams, that ecosystem creates a positive learning culture. So what's the role of the manager and the subject matter expert or the SME in all of that? That's where we focus on the we, right? The manager helps drive culture within their team, not only by helping them to navigate the skills and skills gap within their teams, but encouraging them to acquire knowledge on their own. The simple fact of a manager sharing an article, encouraging them to look at other topics, we know that that drives not only the teams to more compliance. In other words, we know that when a manager sends out an email, that is the fastest way you can get someone to read it. Even an email from the CEO isn't read as fast as a manager email. We have that KPI, we know those statistics. So the manager's involvement in the development on fixing the expectations, but also encouraging learning on an everyday basis is key to development.
I agree.
The role of the SME. The SME could be the manager, but it could be somebody on the team that likes to communicate knowledge. But the primary problem of the SME or the traditional SME is they are an encyclopedia of knowledge. The role of L&D to work with SMEs is to help them filter, structure that knowledge, and create content that they can share across to people who need it in the best way. So, in fact, the role of L&D is to transform the SME into an influencer. Just like influencers in social media, they understand what content is the most relevant. They can create that content in very short and impactful ways. They share it to their community, and they stay connected to their communities by building a following of people who admire them and will listen to them. So in the same way the manager can have influence on their teams, an SME or an influencer can have influence on the community they serve.
So you provide the training for managers and influencers so that they can do that?
Right. So it's slightly different on what the role of an LXP is for managers. The role of an LXP for managers or technology, give them the visibility of not only the mandatory and assigned training, but also the other types of training that is personalized. helping them with their development by talking about those skills gaps, talking about their career and their development, not only once a year, but on a more frequent basis. That's the role of technology for the managers. The role of technology for influencers is how can we help those influencers create content and disseminate that content easily. So they have very similar types of responsibility, but technology enables it in different ways.
So just to add to that, I talked earlier about the roles of learning and development, the roles and the skills that are needed for learning and development. I think one of the important things is we just talked about managers, we just talked about the social learning, the subject matter experts. How does learning and development enable that? How do they provide that environment for that to happen? And I think some of the skills that they need is to look at how they can develop that environment, how they can communicate that environment and the values to the individual and the values to the managers. Because ultimately the managers needs to know what's in it for me as a manager as well as a learner. So those are some of the aspects of the skills that learning and development need to look at and how to enable that environment rather than just telling somebody to do some training. It's a very different, it's a switch, and it's one that needs, and it's one that needs practice, it needs knowledge to speak to other organizations that have done this around the world.
That's a great point. Managers are humans like everybody else, even though sometimes they don't appear to be. And they can be very selfish about the way they're looking at their teams. If I develop them, if I talk about their careers, they will leave. And the reflex, and you've said it before, Andrew, is they'll leave anyway if you don't develop them, and they'll probably leave faster. At least when they leave the team, they'll stay within the same organization. So managers have to have the mindset that they are not only responsible for their tiny ecosystem, but they're responsible for being a key retainer to keep good talent within an organization. And that means sometimes I have to encourage development past what I'm able to give them in my immediate team. And that's not a reflex they all have.
Makes sense.
Understood.
Thank you.
Okay.
We'd like to talk about the importance of the CLO because of most of the company in Japan doesn't have a CLO. Mean that the top management doesn't understand the importance of the CLO, and we'd like to a little bit talk about difference between CHRO and CLO, and would you like to explain a little bit about and stress the importance of especially CLO?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. When I started out in learning and development, the title CLO didn't exist 25 years ago. We had heads of training and we had heads of learning, but Chief Learning Officer was an idea that was actually considered quite ridiculous at the time. Yes, because learning or training was looked at as something very transactional, operational, compliance-driven, not a part of strategy. And more across the last 15 years, this combination of an expertise of needing somebody to lead learning strategy came about because we realized this alignment that we were talking about, this alignment with business and how development can actually help in keeping companies competitive became more and more prevalent. And so now, when we see organizations naming CLO, we understand that the CEO understands the important strategic nature. So the difference, the primary difference, is we went from something very tactical and operational in heads of learning to a chief learning officer role that's more strategic, that's a better business partner. And usually the CLO reports up to the CHRO, the head of HR. So it's embedded within HR. But some organizations, the CLO reports into business transformation. And my prediction of the future is that the more that CLO reports to the business and not to the HR, the better we can be in partnership and the better business impact learning can have. Like head of university is what I like. The role I wanted was head of corporate university, and that's what it was called when I started in like 2000, 2004.
It was only 2010 that it started.
It started, and that was like very few in the U.S. And now it's common even in Europe to have CLO role. Yeah.
And I think, you know, ultimately the job description, the skills requirements of the CLO is very different to head of training, or head of learning, because it does include that strategic component.
Yeah, see, you know what? That's a really important point, because to be a head of learning, you had to have done executive education, you had to have done training deployment, shared services director kind of for learning. That was the important step or skill set you needed to be a head of learning or head of corporate university. Today, what they ask for a CLO in terms of their skill set is, have you done digital learning? Which is a big surprise, you know. Nobody was thinking digital learning was going to be, you know, a stepping stone into being a CLO. Today, it's a mandatory rite of passage. The second kind of profile they're looking for is somebody who's had an MBA, so more business focused, right? And the third skill set they're looking for is consultancy. Have you been a business consultant? So what you see in the new generation of CLO is really, have you gone by one of the big five or big four in consulting? Have you been able to run a P&L or been a business leader? That's the new profile of the CLO.
So they have to change the business of the company from the line, right?
Right.
Good question. Do you see a trend of people that move into CLO roles as people that are coming from the business, you know, from a line of business? So the head of sales going into being a CLO, or do you see any trends, or head of operations going into be a CLO? Do you see that trend?
Yeah, we. I think we had somebody yesterday. I mean, that's definitely where it makes sense is if these GM heads of businesses. When we talk about GMs and heads of business who already have a good sense of HR, which, by the way, the new role of the GM usually has to have one HR role in it so they can understand. So you see the crossover. HR leaders need business experience and business leaders need HR experience. So we see that this alignment is getting better and better. But absolutely, CLOs can come from the business when they have that good HR sense and the desire for this kind of growth mindset, the desire to develop people. That is the new kind of vision and the new profile of the CLO.
そしたらすいません。最後にですね、2人からコメントをいただきたいと思いますので、お願いいたします。まずはアンドリューさんからお願いします。
Yes, certainly. So I think what we're seeing today is disruption. We see it in industry, we see it in the economies of the world. And I think one of the things to be prepared for that disruption is to have a technology that will support identifying the skills you have to help you build the skills for the future, as Annee-san was explaining earlier. And to have that technology in place today to help you tomorrow is going to be important. Degreed focuses on measuring skills, producing skills data, and supporting people and in their transition over time to develop new skills. So Degreed is absolutely focused on supporting businesses to be ready for disruption, to be ready for the future. So thank you very much for today. Appreciate the time to be able to speak to you all, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
When we're looking at macroeconomics and what's going to be happening this year, I think the reflex is to cut training budgets. When we go into recessions, the first thing that goes is training budgets. And that is absolutely the wrong thing to do. So the best way to prepare for this future, a future of potential economic disruption, is to really invest in your people, invest in their development, because they are the ones that are going to help us to survive an economic recession. When we don't invest, they leave, and we lack the talent in the organization to help us succeed and weather and be resilient and agile. So for me, the biggest recommendation I can give is to double down on that investment, to look at that investment as a return on investment of your people to be more competitive. So, どうもありがとうございます。
ありがとうございます。じゃあ、
そうですね。本当に変えなければいけない。今決断をしなきゃいけないんじゃないかなと思います。その決断が遅くなればなるほど、私たちはもう時代にどんどん置いていかれるので、あと現場で学ばなきゃいけない人たちがどんどん置いていかれますから、早く決断をして早くこう変えていくということが必要なんじゃないかなと思いますね。はい、今日はどうもありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。
じゃあ、See you again.
See you again soon.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.